Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, just sound checking. First of all, I would like to highlight that I'm here speaking on behalf of my boss, Hafez Ghanem, whom most of you know, who was scheduled to attend this conference, but who had a last-minute change in schedule. So I'm here bringing his apologies for not being here. And I'll try to step in his very large shoes, figuratively and really. So look, my reaction to Professor Collier's speech would come in probably three points. One, I will be sharing with you how at the World Bank, knowledge, economic networks, and development policy have actually evolved over time. Second, I will discuss a couple of specific initiatives that we are implementing in this area in the Africa region under the leadership of Hafez Ghanem. And third, I will be talking about the need for innovation network on the continent of Africa to be continent-wide. On the first point, I think it is obvious that knowledge, the notion that knowledge is central to economic transformation and development is not new. But what is actually quite difficult to understand from my perspective is that we still are in search of the optimal set of institutional and policy framework that really promote the creation and diffusion of knowledge in our economies, especially in low-income economies. We do not know that much, honestly, on how knowledge spillover do happen. And this has been even more challenging lately because of the fragmentation of the production process that was known to actually drive knowledge spillovers. Professor Collier mentioned the geographical location of knowledge externalities in China, which was definitely the way this was understood. But it is less and less the case that knowledge takes place in a specific location. Instead, the role of knowledge networks, of research networks, is certainly becoming more and more prominent. At the World Bank, under the leadership of President Wolfensohn at the end of the 90s, we embarked on what he then called the Knowledge Bank, which obviously sounds oxymoronic because then most people did not associate bankers with deep knowledge or deep thinking. But President Wolfensohn, who was then assisted by Professor Stiglitz as chief economist, and Professor Collier here as director of research, all came up with this World Development Report in 1998 on knowledge and development, knowledge for development, K4D. In preparing this conference, I actually took another look at that report, and let me just read you a quote from that WDR 1998. It says, and I quote, "Economies are built not merely through the accumulation of physical capital and human skills, but on a foundation of information, learning, and adaptation." And it continues, "The remotest village has the possibility of tapping a global store of knowledge beyond the dreams of anyone living a century ago, and more quickly and cheaply than anyone imagined possible only few decades ago. So when I read that, I thought for a second, well, it's probably the case that economists have perfect foresight, but just sometimes. Perfect foresight, because I don't think authors of the WDR 1998 could even imagine that by 2019, most of the top firms on Wall Street would actually be knowledge firms. They probably did not anticipate that by 2019, Kenya in East Africa would be the world leader in financial inclusion, drawing on an idea that was in India, that was in Kenya. So I think the way knowledge has been shaping our thinking at the World Bank, since WDR has actually had the effect of making knowledge a more prominent line of business. We have seen an increase, a steady increase in our reimbursable analytical services, where more and more countries, especially middle-income countries, have increased their borrowing for knowledge work at the bank. And early on in my career, I actually spent a lot of time working on Malaysia on a purely knowledge-driven portfolio. This has actually led to a number of innovations where we have now had an office in Malaysia for the only purpose of disseminating knowledge on Asian development across the world. So when you ask some of our middle-income countries why they're still borrowing from the World Bank while they can actually raise money on markets, the answer is always very simple and in one word: knowledge. The knowledge that comes with lending services is what actually drives and maintains our lending in middle-income countries. So it is for us absolutely obvious that knowledge and development policy are intrinsically linked, and they should not be opposed. And in that same quote, as I was listening to Professor Collier, I like that emphasis on adaptation. There is no possibility of harnessing knowledge if we don't have the institutions to actually correct, if we don't have the institutions that would allow us to initiate course correction. And if there is one important lesson I have learned from the East Asian model that our countries in Africa and probably in the Middle East can still learn from, is that ability to have a course correction mechanism for each policy that is adopted. So what we are now doing in the Africa region is in line with the pillars of the knowledge economy that we have adopted since 1998. And those pillars of the knowledge economy include education and training. We had 4 important pillars: education and training, and Professor Collier spoke about tertiary education. Second pillar is the information infrastructure. And today, that information infrastructure is certainly powered by the digital infrastructure, and I'll come back to that. The third pillar is the institutional regime and the economic incentive for the knowledge economy to thrive. And here, this is referring to the regulatory framework. I'll come back to that. And the fourth pillar is innovation systems, which ERF and AERC, among others, the research network, are part of. When Hafiz Ghanem became the vice president of the Africa region, Sub-Saharan Africa region, in July of last year, one of the major ideas he brought that has now been adopted as part of our new strategy is to launch a continent-wide digital moonshot. And that idea, which started when he was the vice president for MENA, which is leveraging the digital revolution to power growth and to leapfrog wherever it's necessary. This idea of a digital moonshot captures basically all the pillars of the knowledge economy. One of the most important part of our digital moonshot agenda is the provision of digital infrastructure. And the reason why he has been referring to the moonshot is because we are moving to a different level of ambitions when it comes to Africa. It's having targets so high that people would believe we are crazy, but that's exactly the point. The targets, for example, of achieving universal access for firms, for governments, and for individuals in Africa by 2030 is certainly one of those crazy, crazy targets, but that's what a moonshot is. The second element of the digital moonshot is provision of digital skills. And digital skills certainly are part of, or should be part of, the curriculum in tertiary education, but it's more and more the case that digital skills do not have to wait for the tertiary education to be, to be provided in the education system. And there are a number of areas now, a number of places in Africa where coding and all the basic digital skills are being taught to population. The third element is digital platforms. Digital platforms which would leverage the physical connectivity to allow governments to be more productive, allow government to actually implement more efficiently their own programs. One very good example is the management of our social transfers, our cash transfer programs that would benefit tremendously from implementation of the creation of digital platform. And the last but not least element in our digital moonshot program is the regulatory framework. My office has now launched a new study on the digital economy, and one of the areas we are focusing on is the right regulatory framework for the digital economy for sub-Saharan African countries. More importantly, we want to make sure the digital economy serves the objective of eradicating poverty in Africa instead of just being a play by large companies. It is important for the regulatory framework to encourage competition within the telecommunication and ICT sector to lower the cost of access, otherwise that objective of universal coverage would not be achieved. So here are the four important elements of the digital economy, a digital moonshot that we are embarking on in the Africa region, and I just want to make sure that each of them actually touches on, the pillar of the knowledge economy and the points that Professor Collier was discussing earlier. Now, let me close by highlighting two important initiatives that Hafez has really wanted me to highlight here. And the two initiatives are about, highlighting the importance of research networks on the continent, but also bringing them closer together. As you know, Hafez is both fellow of ERF and of AERC. AERC is the equivalent of ERF for sub-Saharan Africa. And both networks have been doing extremely well, but have actually been progressing in parallel. So the challenge Hafez is throwing is, can we actually start really thinking continent-wide when it comes to Africa in terms of research? So, two things he has suggested, and I'm very, very pleased to announce here, are the following. One, we will launch a joint research program between AERF and AERC. We would work with these two institutions, and the World Bank would be happy to work with the two research networks on a research program on the impact of the African digital connectivity. And that research agenda would bring together researchers of the whole continent of Africa to provide insight on, first, digital connectivity. We need to know how to reach that universal coverage. I think it's important, as Paul said, to discuss and understand the mechanics of achieving those long-term and big objectives. The second area of focus is going to be emphasizing the need for the digital revolution to be inclusive. And being inclusive here is not just about ensuring that the digital serves the underprivileged, especially how the digital can actually boost productivity in agriculture, which remains the sector that employs the largest portion of the population in sub-Saharan Africa, but most importantly, the area that concentrates the largest number of poor people. So how do we make sure the digital revolution in Africa is inclusive? And that also includes, that also includes gender, the gender dimension of the digital revolution. We'll also discuss financial inclusion, which Kenya has actually taken to a global scale, as I mentioned earlier. And we will definitely, I'm here calling on all the researchers and all the members of ERF to join those in AERC to come up with, extremely, solid papers that we would all be happy to use to advise our governments in Africa. The second idea, which is also a joint AERC, ERF, is the launch of the Junior Arthur Lewis Prize for Development Economics on the continent of Africa that the World Bank will be sponsoring. We chose Arthur Lewis to name this prize for obvious reason that you certainly know, not only a pioneer of development, but the first Nobel Prize winner in economics of African descent. But even more importantly, he's the academic who has actually, also excelled as advisor to policymakers. You probably know that Arthur Lewis advised Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, to make sure some of his ideas were actually implemented. So the Arthur Lewis Prize, the Junior Arthur Lewis Prize, would be the equivalent of the John Bates Clark Medal for young African economists, both from the AERC and the ERF network, and the World Bank would be extremely pleased to sponsor this prize. So this is the message I had for you from Hafez Ghanem, and I look forward to working with all of you to implement these programs, but also to ensure that research networks such as the ERF take their full place in the development of the continent of Africa. Thank you very much.